The night was silent and cold, and Daniel was alone in the scrapyard once again. He had worked there for years collecting old machines and broken parts, and he was used to the sound of silence around him, but tonight something felt different, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. He pushed a heavy cart across the dusty ground and looked at the old observatory that stood in the distance like a forgotten tower of secrets. The place had been closed for decades, and no one ever went there, but Daniel often felt the strange pull to look at it, as if something was inside watching him back. As he worked, he noticed a strange glow in the sky. At first he thought it was a shooting star, but the light grew brighter and brighter, until it seemed to tear across the clouds like a wound in the dark. The sound came next a low roar that shook the ground beneath his boots and rattled the junk piles around him. Daniel dropped the cart and stared as the light crashed into the hills. Behind the scrapyard, smoke rose in the distance, and the night filled with the smell of burning metal and scorched earth. His heart pounded, and fear twisted inside him. But curiosity was stronger than fear. He picked up a heavy wrench for courage and made his way across the rocky ground toward the smoke. The closer he got, the more he could feel the heat of the crash, and the air seemed alive with static, as if lightning had touched down and refused to leave. When he reached the crater, he saw something that made his breath catch. It was not a meteor, and it was not a piece of human machine. It was a pod, smooth and silver, glowing faintly with strange patterns that shifted across its surface like water flowing over stone. The pod hissed and opened with a sound like steam escaping. Daniel raised the wrench higher, his knuckles white with fear. But then he saw her, a girl, small, fragile, with skin that shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Her eyes were wide and glowing, pale blue, filled with fear and pain. She staggered out of the pod and almost fell to the ground. Daniel rushed forward without thinking and caught her before she could hit the dirt. Her body was cold and trembling, and her voice came weak but clear. "This is your only chance, human. Do not fail me." Daniel froze, the wrench slipping from his hand. Her words echoed in his mind, louder than the crash and the fire around them. She clutched at his shirt, her fingers shaking, her eyes searching his face as if begging him for something he could not yet understand. He tried to speak, but his mouth felt dry. "Who are you?" he asked, finally, his voice rough with fear. She shook her head. Slowly, her glowing eyes filled with a mix of shame and hope. "No time," she whispered. "They are coming. You must help me or all is lost." Daniel felt his legs weaken, and he glanced at the dark sky above. There was nothing there, only stars, but deep inside he knew she was telling the truth. Something else was out there, something dangerous, and it was coming closer with every passing moment. He looked back at her fragile form and saw how she held her side, where dark liquid stained her strange clothing. She was hurt, and yet she had crossed the stars to find him, a simple man in a forgotten scrapyard. "We me?" he asked, his voice breaking. She trembled and looked away as if afraid to answer, because she said finally, "Humans are different. You take chances, you fight even when you should run. You are our only hope." Daniel did not understand, and yet something inside him stirred a fire that had long been buried beneath years of dull work and quiet nights. She looked at him again, and her shy voice trembled with urgency. "This is your only chance, human. Do not fail me." The words wrapped around his heart like chains. He felt the weight of something greater than himself pressing down. Scrapyard seemed smaller, the world seemed darker, and yet in her eyes he saw a light that demanded action. Daniel tightened his grip around her as the night air grew colder, and the sound of distant engines echoed across the hills. Something was coming, and he knew his life would never be the same. Again Daniel half carried and half dragged the strange girl back to the scrapyard, and every step felt heavier than the last, as if the night itself was pushing against him. Her skin was cold like ice, yet her eyes still glowed faintly in the dark, and she kept whispering broken words that made no sense to him. He laid her down on an old blanket inside the small shack where he usually rested during breaks, and he lit a lantern that filled the room with a weak yellow glow. The girl shivered and curled in on herself like a frightened child, and Daniel sat beside her unsure what to do because nothing in his life had prepared him for this. He tried to ask her who she was and where she had come from, but she only shook her head and pressed a small object into his hands. It was round and faintly pulsing with a dim light, almost like a heart still beating. He wanted to throw it away, but the way she looked at him stopped him, and he felt as if the object itself was alive and watching him. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke, and she told him that it was the core, and that the enemy would never stop until they had it. Daniel asked her what it did, but she only said it could end everything, or it could save everything, and she begged him to keep it safe no matter what happened to her. Her words sent a chill through his body because he could see the fear in her eyes, and yet beneath the fear was something deeper, a trust she was forcing herself to give him. He felt the weight of the core in his hand, heavier than any piece of iron or steel he had ever lifted in his years at the scrapyard. The sound of engines roared faintly in the distance, and the ground seemed to shake with a rhythm that was not natural. The girl looked toward the window, her eyes widening, and she whispered that the hunters had arrived and that they would destroy anything in their path until they found her. Daniel wanted to believe it was all a dream, that he had simply lost his mind from working too many lonely nights, but the trembling in his chest told him otherwise. He could not run because there was nowhere to run, and the girl was too weak to move. She clutched his arm with surprising strength, her voice breaking with desperation as she begged him not to hand her over, because if he did, then everything would burn. Daniel had never been more afraid in his life, but something in him refused to let go of her hand. He had always been ordinary, a man no one noticed, a man who lived and worked in silence. Yet in this moment, he felt that ordinary was no longer possible. He looked into her glowing eyes and saw the reflection of the fire that had crashed from the sky, and in that reflection he saw himself standing not as a scrapyard worker, but as someone who could choose. The engines grew louder outside and lights swept across the piles of junk like searching eyes hungry for prey. The girl whispered her name for the first time, her voice small and hesitant, as if the sound itself was a secret she had never dared to share. She told him she was called Lyra, and that her people had sent no one else because no one believed she would succeed. They thought she was weak, they thought she was a mistake, but she had stolen the core because she believed someone somewhere could still be trusted. Daniel felt his throat tighten because he knew what it was like to be overlooked and forgotten, and he realized that she was not only asking for his help, she was asking him to believe in her when no one else ever had. Outside the shack, shadows moved between the piles of scrap, and strange machines with glowing red eyes hissed as they scanned the ground. Lyra gripped his hand tighter and whispered that if they found her, she would rather die than let them take the core, and she begged him once more, "This is your only chance, human. Do not fail me." The words struck deep inside Daniel, and the weight of the core seemed heavier than his own life. Yet he nodded slowly, his jaw tight with a determination he did not know he had. He told her he would not hand her over, he would protect her even if it cost him everything, and he felt the truth of his promise burn in his chest. Lyra looked at him with wide eyes as if she could not believe a human could speak such words with such certainty, and for the first time she allowed a single tear to fall down her cheek, a tear that shimmered like crystal in the lantern light. Shack rattled as something heavy landed outside, and the sound of metallic claws scraped across the dirt. Daniel pushed Lyra gently back against the blanket and told her to stay quiet while he picked up the largest piece of iron pipe he could find. His hands shook, but he stood tall because he knew he could not let fear rule him. The door creaked as a shadow passed across it, and the light dimmed as if the night itself was holding its breath. Lyra whispered one last time, her voice trembling yet filled with faith, "Do not fail me," and Daniel tightened his grip on the pipe, his heart pounding louder than the engines outside, knowing that this was only the beginning of something far greater than himself. The night was torn open by the screech of metal claws as the machines searched the scrapyard, and their red lights swept across the broken piles like hungry eyes searching for prey. Daniel pressed his back against the shack wall, his hand tight around the iron pipe, while Lyra shivered under the blanket, her glowing eyes watching him with fear and hope. He could hear the machines hissing in strange voices as they moved closer, and he knew the shack would not protect them for long. His breath came hard and fast, but he forced himself to stay calm, because panic would only get them both killed. He waited until the nearest shadow passed by the window, and then he grabbed Lyra, pulling her close and whispering that they had to move now before the hunters surrounded the shack completely. She nodded weakly, her body trembling, but her trust in him was clear as she clung to the small core and followed his lead. Daniel pushed open the back door, and they slipped out into the night, the cold air hitting their faces as they moved between the towering piles of scrap. The ground crunched beneath their boots, and every sound felt like thunder to Daniel's ears, yet somehow they remained unseen as the hunters scanned the wrong direction. For a moment hope rose inside him, but then sharp cry split the air as one of the machines caught their scent and turned its glowing eyes toward them. "Run!" Daniel shouted, and Lyra stumbled beside him as they dashed through the maze of twisted iron and broken cars. The hunters gave chase, their claws scraping and their engines roaring like beasts unleashed from cages. Daniel's lungs burned and his legs ached, but he pulled Lyra along, refusing to let her fall behind. He could hear the machines gaining ground and fear clawed at his chest. Yet he pushed harder because surrender was not an option. They burst through the edge of the scrapyard and into the open fields where the moonlight painted everything silver and cold. The hunters followed close, their shadows stretching long across the grass as they moved with terrifying speed. Lyra gasped for breath, her steps faltering, and Daniel realized she would not last much longer without rest. He dragged her into the cover of a line of trees, the branches scratching his arms as they pushed deeper into the forest. Night was alive with the sound of pursuit, the machines crashing through the undergrowth, relentless and merciless. Daniel pressed Lyra against the trunk of a tree and told her to stay quiet as he raised the iron pipe again, his hands shaking, but his eyes burning with determination. When the first hunter lunged out of the dark, its red eyes glowing, he swung with all his strength, and the pipe connected with a sharp crack that sent sparks flying. The machine staggered, but it did not fall. Instead, it hissed louder and slashed at him with claws that tore the bark of the tree inches from his head. Daniel roared with desperation and swung again and again until the machine finally collapsed in a shower of sparks, its body twitching on the ground. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his arms aching, but Lyra rushed to him, her eyes wide with shock and gratitude. "You fought it," she whispered. "You are only human, but you fought it and won." Daniel looked at her and shook his head, saying it was not about winning, it was about surviving and keeping her safe. But there was no time for rest, because more hunters were coming, their lights weaving through the trees like ghostly lanterns. Daniel pulled Lyra to her feet, and they ran again, deeper into the forest, the sound of pursuit never fading. Lyra stumbled, often her strength failing, and finally she collapsed to the ground, clutching her side where the wound had grown worse. Daniel dropped beside her, panic rising, but she pushed the core into his hands and told him to take it and leave her behind, because he would have a chance to escape if he was alone. Daniel shook his head fiercely and refused, saying he would not abandon her and that he did not care if he died as long as he kept his promise. Tears welled in Lyra's eyes, and she whispered that her own people had called her weak and useless, and that she had believed them for so long. But now she said, looking at him with trembling voice, "You make me believe I was wrong. You make me believe courage can be found even in fear." Daniel felt his throat tighten, and he told her, "Being weak does not mean you cannot be brave." The machines closed in their footsteps, pounding like drums in the night, and Daniel knew they could not outrun them much longer. He lifted Lyra in his arms despite his exhaustion and carried her through the dark forest, his muscles screaming with pain but his will unbroken. The hunters howled behind them, their red eyes blazing through the shadows, yet somehow Daniel kept moving one step at a time, one breath at a time. Finally, the trees opened into a clearing where the ruins of an old highway stretched across the land, cracked and broken from years of neglect. Daniel stumbled onto the asphalt and laid Lyra down gently, his chest heaving as he looked around for a way out. Above them, the sky shimmered with light, and his heart sank as he saw the massive shadow of a ship sliding into orbit. Enemy mothership had arrived, and its presence filled the night with dread. Lyra gazed up at it, her eyes wide with despair, and she whispered that time was running out, and that if the core was taken, the galaxy would fall into ruin. Daniel clenched his fists and stared at the ship, then back at her, and he swore to himself that he would not let it happen. Even if he had to stand against the impossible, even if it cost him his life, he would protect her. And he would protect the core. As the hunters closed in from the forest, and the sky darkened with the shadow of the ship, Daniel felt the fire inside him grow stronger than ever before. This was no longer about fear or survival. This was about a promise. This was about hope, and he knew the fight had only just begun. The clearing shook under the weight of the hunters as they closed in from every direction, their red eyes glowing like fires in the night, and their metal bodies scraping against the broken highway. Daniel stood over Lyra, his chest heaving and his grip tight on the iron pipe, but he knew the pipe would not be enough. Not against the endless machines, and not against the shadow of the great ship. Above, Lyra whispered weakly that it was hopeless, that the core would be taken, and her people would die, and she begged him again to run and save himself while he still could. Daniel dropped to one knee beside her, his eyes burning as he told her he would not leave her, and that humans were not built to run when someone needed them. She stared at him, her lips trembling as if she could not understand such stubbornness. And then tears filled her glowing eyes as she clutched the core tightly against her chest. The sound of the hunters grew louder, the ground trembling as they advanced step by step, and Daniel knew they had only moments left before they were surrounded. He searched the horizon desperately, his mind racing, and then his gaze fell on the old observatory standing like a broken tower at the edge of the hills. The thought came to him like a spark in the darkness, and he realized the observatory was filled with old satellite dishes and broken transmitters, machines built to reach for the stars, even if they had long since fallen silent. A wild plan formed in his mind, reckless and desperate and dangerous, but it was the only chance they had. He turned to Lyra and told her that if they could reach the observatory, he could use the old equipment to overload the sky and send a blast strong enough to cripple the hunters and maybe even strike the great ship above. Lyra shook her head, her voice trembling as she said that humans could not stand against such power, that her people had tried and failed with weapons far stronger than anything here. But Daniel leaned close, his voice fierce as he told her that humans were not like her people, because humans fought, even when the fight was hopeless, and sometimes that was enough to turn the impossible into victory. Her eyes widened at his words, and for the first time he saw not fear in them, but the faint light of belief. Hunters burst from the trees, their claws gleaming, and Daniel lifted Lyra in his arms once more, his legs screaming with pain as he ran down the broken highway toward the distant observatory. The machines roared behind them, firing beams of searing light that scorched the asphalt and shattered the crumbling road around him. He weaved and stumbled, but he never stopped running, his heart thundering with every step. His breath ragged in the freezing night air. Lyra clung to him, her small body trembling against his chest, yet her grip on the core never loosened, not even for a heartbeat. Hill rose steep before them, and Daniel forced his aching legs to climb. Every step a battle against gravity and despair, while the hunters tore after them, relentless and merciless. At last they reached the observatory gates, rusted and broken, yet still towering above them, and Daniel kicked through the old door, dragging Lyra inside. Dust filled the air, and shadows stretched across the walls where broken wires and shattered glass lay scattered like forgotten bones. The massive dish above groaned in the wind, and Daniel prayed it would hold for just one more fight. He laid Lyra gently on the floor beside the shattered control panels, and grabbed at the wires and switches, pulling and twisting until sparks burst to life. He barely understood the machines, but he knew enough to make chaos, and chaos was all they needed. Lyra coughed weakly and told him the core could release power if she connected it to the dish, but she warned that the energy could destroy them both if it was unleashed without control. Daniel looked into her eyes and told her with a steady voice that he trusted her and that together they would make it work. Her hands shook as she pressed the core into the heart of the machine, and the observatory began to hum with a deep and powerful vibration, like the earth itself was waking from a long sleep. Outside, the hunters gathered, their shadows flickering across the broken windows as they prepared to storm the building. Lyra looked at him one last time, her shy voice trembling with fear and hope as she whispered, "You believe in me more than I believe in myself." Daniel smiled faintly, though his body shook with exhaustion, and he answered that sometimes that was all a person needed, someone else to believe when they could not. The doors exploded inward as the hunters charged, their claws tearing through the air and their voices hissing with fury. Daniel swung the iron pipe with every ounce of strength left in him, striking the first machine that entered, sparks bursting as metal clashed with metal. Behind him, the core flared brighter and brighter, filling the observatory with blinding light as Lyra poured her energy into it, her voice breaking with pain but her spirit unyielding. The great dish above them groaned and tilted skyward, the hum rising to a roar until it was no longer sound but a force that shook the ground and rattled Daniel's bones. He fought on against the endless tide, his arms bleeding, his breath ragged, but still he stood, still he struck, still he refused to fall. Lyra cried out his name, her voice no longer shy but fierce and full of fire, as the core reached its peak and the observatory filled with a storm of light. Daniel knew this was the gamble of humanity, the choice to fight with nothing but willpower and hope, and he prayed that it would be enough. The hunters screamed as the light burst outward, flooding the night and climbing into the sky like a river of fire aimed at the great ship that loomed above. The blast struck, and the earth shook with a thunder greater than any storm, and for one breathless moment, the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Blast from the observatory tore through the sky like a burning river, and the night turned white with fire as the great dish released all its power at once. Daniel staggered back, his arms shaking as the hunters were caught in the wave of energy, their bodies sparking and collapsing one after another as the storm ripped them apart. The ground trembled, the walls cracked, and the roof groaned under the force, yet still the light climbed higher, reaching for the ship that waited above. Like a giant shadow, Lyra cried out, her voice echoing through the chamber, her hands gripping the core as it blazed with unbearable brilliance. Her body shook with the effort, her small frame almost breaking under the weight of the power she channeled, yet her eyes were fierce, no longer shy, but burning with a will she had never known before. Daniel stumbled to her side and shielded her from falling debris, his chest aching with every breath, his body broken, yet his spirit refusing to bend above them. The enemy ship shuddered as the storm struck its hull, tearing through its shields and burning across its surface. For the first time, the invincible predator of the stars trembled under the defiance of a single human and a fragile alien girl. Flames erupted across the sky as the ship cracked open its engines, failing its weapons silenced, its shadow breaking apart into falling fire that rained down like dying stars. Daniel fell to his knees beside Lyra as the core dimmed its light, fading slowly after the storm had ended. Smoke filled the air, and silence followed the destruction, a silence so deep that Daniel could hear only his heartbeat and the ragged breaths of the girl who had placed all her faith in him. He touched her shoulder gently and whispered that it was over, that they had done it. Lyra opened her glowing eyes, weak but alive, and she whispered back that she had never believed it was possible that humans could be more than she imagined. Her voice shook as tears rolled down her cheeks, but her tears were not of fear, they were of relief and of hope. Daniel smiled faintly, though his body was heavy and his vision blurred because for the first time in his life he felt he had done something that mattered, something beyond himself. The observatory stood broken, the machines around them destroyed, and the sky above scattered with falling wreckage. Yet through the chaos, a new light appeared. Ships descended, not hunters, but allies, ships of Lyra's people, drawn by the signal of the core and the destruction of the enemy. They landed in silence, their figures stepping onto the broken ground, their eyes wide with disbelief as they saw what had been done. They stared at Daniel, the ordinary man standing bloodied and exhausted with nothing in his hands but an iron pipe, and they could not understand how a human had stood against the impossible and survived. Lyra struggled to her feet and stood beside him, her voice trembling but strong as she told them it was not her who had destroyed the hunters, was him. It was the human who refused to run, who refused to fail her. People bowed their heads in silence, their pride shaken, their certainty broken, because the one they had mocked and ignored, the shy girl they had cast aside, had found strength, not in herself alone but in the courage of someone they had never believed in. Daniel said nothing because he was too tired to speak, and because words felt small compared to the fire that still burned inside his chest. But when Lyra looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude, and whispered, "You were our only chance, and you did not fail me," he felt the weight of everything lift from his shoulders. The allies took Lyra and the core, preparing to return to their world and to rebuild from the ashes of what had been lost. Daniel stood at the edge of the observatory, watching as the ships lifted into the night sky, their light filling the darkness like a promise that the future could still be saved. Lyra looked back from the ramp of her ship, her shy smile returning, though now there was strength in it, a strength born from trust and from survival. She raised her hand in farewell, and her voice carried softly across the distance, "I will return, human, because now I know your people are more than stories, they are hope." Daniel raised his hand, though his arm trembled, and he watched until the ships vanished into the stars, leaving him alone once more in the silence of the broken observatory. The night was quiet again, the scrapyard far below untouched by what had happened, and the world unaware of the war that had almost ended it. Yet Daniel knew he would never be the same again, because he had seen the truth of what it meant to fight when there was no chance to win, and to keep fighting anyway. He turned back toward the dark road, his steps slow, his body aching, but his heart alive in a way it had never been before. He had been ordinary, once forgotten and unseen, yet now he carried a memory that no one could take from him. The memory of a girl who had whispered, "This is your only chance, human, do not fail me," and of the promise he had kept. And though the night was silent, he felt the echo of her voice in his heart, and he knew that when the stars called again, he would be ready. The end.